Good afternoon, YouTube. This is Chuck, and as you can tell, I'm coming to you from the man cave today. It's kind of a cool, blustery day outside, and it's Thursday, March 14th, 2024, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I got a kind of an offbeat story for you today, and in order to do it, I had to kind of try to figure out a little bit of low tech. I don't have the lights on in here, and I think the light's okay. Uh, the overhead lights just gave way too much glare for what I'm trying to do. But got a story today about an old friend of mine and a guy named Doug. And now, way back a while back, I made a firefighter story video called Firefighter Doug Had an Airplane. This is not the same Doug. This is another guy named Doug. And well, Doug was an old hot rodder, and his wife had died a while back, and he was spending the rest of his days living in the house and just busying himself with all of his projects. And he'd had a whole collection of anything with a motor over the years. I don't think he messed with airplanes. He did mess with radio. He had radio-controlled airplanes, but as far as real ones, I don't think he did. But other than that, he had just about everything else you can imagine that had a motor in it. And he was an old hot rodder, and well, as he got older, he kind of gravitated toward rat rods, and one of the reasons why he did that was because he'd had the kind of ones where you put a sign on them saying, "Please don't touch," and he didn't like that. And so whenever he'd take his rat rods to a car show, he'd tell everybody, "I don't care if you touch it, climb all over it. Get in it, do that's what they're for." And so that kind of became his trademark. Well, he'd lived here for quite a while. And our little town is a retirement town, and there's a lot of retired guys here, and there's quite a custom car scene here. And most of them aren't the real expensive. There are some exotics here, but most of them aren't the real expensive exotics. There's a Corvette club here, but there's a whole lot of guys that have 50s and 60s cars, and there's a fairly large group that have hot rods. And there's a small offshoot of those guys that have rat rods. And I know a lot of them. And well, Doug was kind of a fixture around there. And he lived in the north part of town, lived by himself. And he could almost always be found out in his garage. And so the guys, the local car guys, a lot of them would swing by Doug's house and stop and visit with him. And he was always out puttering in his garage, building this or building that or fiddling around or fixing this. And he had a whole driveway full of vehicles, and just a super nice guy to be around. And I ran into him one day and got to know him, and so I'd go over and stop by and see him every once in a while. And he was always glad to see me, and always wanted to stop and chat. And I'm sure there's some days there's a whole parade of people went in and out of Doug's place, and he probably didn't get a whole lot of work done, but I think he thought that was just fine. That as Doug started getting a little bit older, he started spending a little less time in the shop, but he still liked having visitors, and the neighbors around where he was at, they kept they'd kind of keep his eye on him. And so I noticed as I'd go over and see him, they'd talk less and less about cars and more about doctor's visits and aches and pains, and how some old friend that he knew for years had passed away. And you could tell that he was getting kind of close to the end of the trail. And where he lived at had a homeowners association. Every once in a while they'd get on his case about too many vehicles. And so finally some of the neighbors that had a little bit of room, they let him park some of their stuff over at their house, just so that he wouldn't have so much stuff. There was a thing about parking in the street. You couldn't do that unless you were a visitor. And so you had to have everything in the driveway, and he'd have everything in the driveway. Now, you might have to turn sideways to walk between them, but he'd have them all tucked in there somehow. Well, it was kind of an unwritten rule at Doug's place that if I got to hit this again and turn this back on. There you go. Turn it back on again. You'll see in a minute what I'm doing here. But anyway, it kind of became an unwritten rule at his place that if the garage door was open, then he wanted visitors. And so if you went over there, even if he wasn't out there working in the garage, if his garage door was open, then it was fine to stop and see him. If the garage door was closed, that meant he either didn't feel like having visitors or he was gone somewhere. Well, he had all kinds of odd projects, and one of the cars he had was a little red Toyota sports car of some kind, and I don't even remember for sure what it was called, but he got this. He saw somewhere where they had a kit where you could put like Lamborghini style raise up doors that lifted up like this. And so he got a set of those hinges and he converted that thing so it had Lambo doors. And it was probably good grief, probably the only one in Arizona that had that. But that was one of his projects. And he was building a rat rod. And the rat rod that I showed you on my community page this morning, and maybe I'll try to stick a picture of that in here somewhere. But that one, he was building the successor to that. And his goal was to get it as low to the ground as he possibly could. And so he chopped it and channeled it and had it literally down in what they call down in the weeds. And the top of the vehicle, it was another old pickup body, and the top of the vehicle was 41 inches off the ground. Well, I sat in that thing, and in order for me, as big as I am, to get into it, I had to literally sit down on the driveway next to it and kind of scooch my way into it. I couldn't even get in and out of it. It was so low. But that's what he wanted, and so that was fine. And he finished it up, and that was his last vehicle. And when he finished that one, he sold the one that I showed you this morning. But as he started, as I say, he started getting older, he started slowing down a little bit. And well, one night, my wife and I were here watching the 9 o'clock news, and the news channels we get here are out of the Phoenix area. Oh, and we got breaking news, small plane crash in Payson. And I perked us up. Now I have a scanner and I listen to it part of the time, but that night I wasn't listening to it. So, film at 11 kind of thing. Well, so I turned the scanner on and listened to the chatter on the scanner. And of course there was a lot of chatter. And I finally figured out from what somebody said that it was up in the north end of town somewhere. Well, Doug's house was right under the pattern, the approach pattern of the airport, and so he had a lot of airplanes fly over his house. And so anyway, I thought, well, yeah, it must be up around Doug's house somewhere, and I heard him mention a street name, and I knew it was right in there close where he was at somewhere. So first thing, next morning I get up and I turn the news on, and of course they had camera crews up here by that time, and so they showed the house where this airplane crashed, and I looked and I said, oh my God, that's Doug's house. Well, yeah, an airplane had crashed and hit Doug's house. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move the camera over here on the tripod, and you'll see my high-tech solution. I've got I got a picture I'm set up on my laptop, and let me sidebar for a second and tell you that I wanted to shoot this part of it. I wanted to shoot it at the site. I wanted to go over there. So I went over there yesterday because I wanted to tell you what happened, where it happened. And the people that live there now, they had so many vehicles in the driveway and a couple of big box trailers in the driveway where you couldn't even see the house. So I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And what I finally ended up doing is I ended up going on Google Earth and going to Street View. And so what I'm going to show you now, and I'm going to set the camera over here. I'm on tripod. Let me line you up on that. Let's see, it's over about, about like that I think will do. Maybe a little more, about like that. Well, that's the Google Street View version of Doug's house. And so let me move that around here just a little bit. So let me tell you exactly how this house was laid out, and let me tell you exactly what happened. Well, this right here, that right there in the middle is the living room. Right behind that is the kitchen and dining room. This wing over on this side is a bedroom wing. This is a bedroom. This is where he kept all of his radio-controlled airplanes and radio-controlled cars and radio-controlled sailboats and everything that he had. So this is kind of his RC room. Right directly behind that was another bedroom, and that was his guest room. Over here was, of course, the garage. And this was about the same size garage as I have. It's just a standard size 2-car garage. And behind that was the master suite. And so his bedroom was this way facing the backyard. and the master bath was right about in here. This was the entrance door right there. Well, I went over to Doug's house the next morning, and oh golly, the TV crews were there, and every kind of agency in the world was there, and they had it surrounded with crime tape. And right after I got there, they actually even closed the street down. They had so many people trying to drive down the street. It was a long cul-de-sac, and traffic got so bad that the police department closed the street down. But I was already there. And so, and Doug at the time, Doug was, he was giving interviews to TV reporters, and oh boy, you could see, the spark in his eye, and he was flirting with all the little female TV reporters, and oh man, he was kind of enjoying being the center of attention there. But the house was still standing, and when you look at it from the angle that you see there, you couldn't even really tell that anything happened. So what I will tell you is that Doug is getting ready to go to bed the night before, and he was here in the living room. And all of a sudden, there was this huge boom, and it shook the whole house. And so he thought something happened out front. So he came out his front door and looked around here, and everything looked normal. He didn't see anything. So he goes back, and he thinks, well, maybe it's behind the house. So he goes out the back door behind the kitchen, and his backyard is just a scene of utter devastation. Absolutely. And all he can recognize is the tail of an airplane. So he knew what had happened. But so he goes into his bedroom, and that whole end of the house is gone. Just literally gone. Well, what happened was that airplane coming in on final approach, and that plane went down, and it hit the back of his house right behind the ridge line right here. So you couldn't even see it from the front. And it came down at a very, very steep angle, probably about a 60-degree angle, came right into his bedroom, hit the concrete slab, and just blew out the whole back of the house. So the whole back of the house in this area right in here was gone. If it had been another 5 minutes later, and Doug would have been in bed, it would have killed him right then and there. Well, the airplane crash killed the two people in the plane, but Doug was right here in the living room, and he escaped unharmed. But as you can well imagine, there was a huge thing. I'm going to come back where I can talk to you. Get a little glimpse of my messy garage there. I try not to show too much of that. But anyway, so Doug wasn't hurt, but obviously his house was a big mess. And this was all, basically a house was all Doug had. So he enjoyed his fame and getting interviewed by the TV crews and flirting with the little female reporters and all this kind of stuff like that. But as you can well imagine, he's well into his 80s by then. And well, let me tell you the follow-up to that. The first thing is, of course, the city came in and told him that the house was uninhabitable. And he's told him, he says, I don't have any place else to go. This is my home. I don't want to leave. And so and then they got kind of insistent about it, and he started arguing with them. And at one point, the police department intervened, and they were going to arrest him. And so the police sergeant that was there actually was the son of a guy who'd been a volunteer firefighter for me for many, many years, and I'd known him ever since he was a little kid. And I actually went up and talked to him. And I said, this is just an old guy, and this is all he's got. And he said, yeah, we know. We'll try to de-escalate this, and we don't want to. We said the last thing we want to do is arrest him. And but he got pretty belligerent, and so finally, what ended up happening is cooler heads prevailed, and they told him that he could remain in the house, but they actually put yellow crime tape right down through the middle of his living room, and they told him he had to stay on the guest wing, which I showed you initially, because there was a bathroom and everything down there. They called an electrician in. They were able to isolate the power to the part that was damaged, and so they could turn his power back on. And the same thing with a plumber to get his water back on. That took a couple of days. But they immediately declared the place a crime scene, and they didn't want anybody in there. So he could stay in his house, but he couldn't go to the damaged part of his house. He had to stay in the undamaged part. And that was okay with him as long as he got to stay home. Well, the other thing that turned out happening is somewhere along the line, he owned his house free and clear, and somewhere along the line, for whether he did it deliberately or because he was getting forgetful, is he had not renewed his insurance, so he was uninsured. Well, the people with the airplane had insurance, and so that insurance company stepped in. But since Doug didn't have an insurance company on his behalf, that meant that he had to try to negotiate with him himself, and he was he was they gave him the runaround, as you can well imagine they would, and so they brought a crew came in and they boarded up that section of the house and basically blocked that whole section, the damaged section, off from the rest of the house. And so he was able to continue living there. He had heat and he had electricity and he had water. And fortunately, the electrical panel and the water heater and all that kind of stuff was in the undamaged part of the house. But it ended up being a long, drawn out affair. It took about a year before they finally got that house actually fixed and back the way it was. And the stress on Doug was just incredible. And I think that that probably ultimately started him circling the drain. And I went over to see him one day, and the place was closed up. And I thought, well, maybe he was gone somewhere, and which is very common the way, because he was there and gone, and he had a son who lived in Flagstaff that came down and helped him a little bit, but not really a lot. And he had a daughter who was kind of a free spirit that lived in Southern California, and she kind of blew in and blew out, but she wasn't the kind of person that was going to come over here and take charge. And so I'd go over and see Doug, and he'd tell me all the horror things that he was going through, and contractors and the insurance company and them trying to weasel out of paying for stuff. And it finally ultimately ended up getting resolved. Now, he was not a big guy for banks, and he wasn't a big guy for lawyers. But he finally had to go hire a lawyer and threaten to sue the insurance company to get him to negotiate in good faith. And I think ultimately what happened is that's what put enough of a strain on him. And I think that probably was what finally got to him. And I went over to see him one day, like I said, and the place was closed up, and I didn't think too much of it. And then I went back over there another time, a couple weeks later, because I hadn't talked to him in quite a while. And so I went over there to see him, and all of his cars are gone. Place closed up, and all of his cars are gone. And I thought, oh my, I know what happened now. There was never any notice of it. There was never an obit in the paper or anything like that. But I knew deep down inside what had ended up happening. And but I didn't hear anything about it for quite some time. And then one day I was on my computer and I'm looking at stuff, and a want ad popped up. And for somebody out of Flagstaff wanting to sell the 1947 Ford hot rod. And I took a look at the picture, and I thought, okay, I know what happened now. That's, because I thought maybe Doug went to a nursing home or something. I didn't know. But that was, I recognized the car immediately. It was a bright yellow two-door 47 Ford. I recognized the wheels that were on it. So what it was his son was selling off his cars. And that meant that old Doug was gone. And eventually I talked to somebody who knew him. And he told me, he'd passed away. He had this crazy last adventure before he ended up dying, and I think the stress that it put on him probably led to his demise, and that was kind of sad. But a little sidebar to that, which is kind of interesting, is that morning when I went over there, he had a neighbor that lived about 3 houses down from him, and who'd stopped by, and I'd met the guy before, but I didn't know him. I just met him. And so I'm standing kind of off to the side, and Doug is having his moment of glory with the cute little TV reporter and getting interviewed. And this neighbor come up, and he knew who I was. And so he come up, I was chatting with him a little bit, and he said, I never thought I'd see one of these again. And I said, what do you mean? And it turned out that before he retired, he worked for the National Transportation Safety Board as an aircraft crash investigator. And he said, I've been to a lot of these. This is the morning after, and he says, I'll tell you exactly what happened. He said that thing hit, it blew apart, there was no fire. That plane was out of gas. He was coming in on his final approach to the airport, and he ran out of fuel and ended up putting it down. And after the long involved investigation, lasted probably, 5-6 months. Yep, that's what they came back and they said. The people in the plane that died were from out of state, and apparently that's it's exactly what happened. Now, if that Doug's garage, everything in his garage was totally untouched. The only thing it did was blew out that corner of the house where the bedroom was. Now, if that would have happened a few minutes later, Doug had been in bed and he'd have been killed. If that plane would have gone another 30 feet before it went down, it would have landed in his backyard and wouldn't have touched his house at all. If it had happened 30 feet sooner, it would have gone right down into his garage and probably blew the whole end off his house. But just the way things occurred and the way it happened, he survived it. And he told me later, he said, he didn't believe in banks, and so he had quite a bit of money hidden in there. And one of the first things he did, and the money was in the bedroom, in a container in the bedroom. I don't know how much money. He never did tell me, and it was none of my business, but he told me about it. He says, the first thing I did, I went in and got that and took it down the other end of the house because I didn't want anybody getting into that. So, interesting story. I thought you might like to hear about it. And old Doug, he was a good guy. He was a friend to everybody. I'm sure he's in a better place now. But anyway, that's a long, convoluted story. I have no idea how long this thing has gone. But I figured you'd be interested in hearing about it. And so let me tell you, like I always do, take care of each other and love each other and take care of yourself. And if you got somebody on your neighborhood that lives there by himself, stop by and say hi every once in a while, because there's a lot of people that are pretty darn lonely. We talk about it on the van videos about people, all they got to do is sit and watch TV all day, and there's a lot of them, and a lot of them would appreciate somebody coming by. And old Doug, every time I'd stop by and see him, he knew what I did for a hobby, and he'd always ask me about my latest adventures, and I'd always tell him. And so anyway, that's my story about my old friend Doug. And so here again, I'm coming to you from the man cave on a cold, blustery day. Hope this all made sense. This is actually the first take on this, and I think I did okay. I'll watch it and see if I like it. And if you see it, I liked it. And if you don't see this version, then I'll have to reshoot it. So right now, until I talk to you again, as I always do, I think I'll just tell you have a great day and peace out.